everyone is doing left-oriented work, broadly construed, whatever it is. And yet at the same time, the student body that populates those graduate programs, not exclusively so, but tend to be upper middle class on above. So I began thinking about this tension of what it means to claim that a department is ostensibly left-wing, progressive, maybe liberal, while at the same time the class composition of the university being one that is disproportionately in service to an economic elite.
It kind of confirmed a lot of what I was thinking about with higher education, which is that a lot of the data that supports, social mobility, people say, well, education is the way forward. It's the way you lift yourself up out of poverty, or this is how you sort of secure a middle-class life. If you, look at the data, the vast majority of people in the bottom quintile of income earners, which of course is not always the best marker of class, but it is, I think, a fairly useful metric. The poorest among us are going, the vast majority, almost half of them don't even enroll in college, right? The starting point for who is entering college is already sort of is being lifted up. And so that data is heavily skewed, and it gets even more skewed as you start looking at, elite institutions like Harvard and Yale and places like this.
I think ultimately, on the one hand, loan forgiveness is a formidable policy, but it has to be coupled with some accountability that's levied upon the universities themselves. And in one way, I think, it might be coming at it from the wrong angle, but this threat of taking away the tax-exempt or extremely low taxation of endowments could be one way to get universities to become more frank and honest about their tuition and fee increases.
College degrees are certainly not a guarantee of a good job in the way that they once were, if they have ever really been that much of an indicator of a good job to begin with, given the fact that, as we kind of discussed, that people who get good jobs tend to come from wealthier backgrounds and are good at networking, and they have a certain capacity for navigating the job market that people from working class backgrounds don't necessarily always get.
I'm kind of given over to Chomsky's propaganda model here, where the general thesis is that those that enter into halls of power, whether it's the media, education, the State Department, and so forth, it's not like they have to be brainwashed. They actually believe in advance in the qualifications and missions for which they're hired for. And the reason why that other people are filtered out is they just aren't going to advance the mission of administrations kind of dressed in DEI or identity or what have you.
Let's imagine like a sort of counterfactual where suddenly there is no university and all of those people would be on the job market. Because one of the things that the university does for 4 years is it allows people to not be on the job market, and it keeps unemployment rates artificially low because you have people who are in school, right? So they don't really count as being unemployed. And I think that's like a very interesting function that intentionally or otherwise that the university has come to serve. It does a kind of job training for companies and for the job market, right? You do your training elsewhere so that the company doesn't have to pay you to train you. Like you have to pay yourself to get trained for the job that you want to get, right? And of course, yeah, you're in school, right? So you're not unemployed. The economy's great, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think that I would love to know more about how those kind of statistics hash out, because that to me, I think is a really compelling and interesting aspect to what higher education does.
Welcome everyone to another Class Unity discussion. Today we're talking about class, capitalism, and higher education with two guests, Mitch Hernandez and Adam Rensch. Mitch Hernandez is a doctoral candidate in the Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature Department at the University of Minnesota. His general interests include the history of neoliberalism and the development of subjectivity within its regimes. His dissertation focuses on the university as a site of clandestine social reproduction. Adam Rensch received his PhD in English and creative writing from the University of Illinois, Chicago. He writes frequently for the Brooklyn Rail on class politics and inequality. And his current book project traces the historical relationship between university creative writing programs, and the decline of working class literature. In preparation for the discussion, members of Class Unity had a chance to read a paper, both unpublished, by each of our guests. Mitch's paper is titled Managerialism, Debt, and the Class Composition of the University, and Adam's is titled Academic Serfdom and the End of Higher Education. So we'd like to begin by offering Mitch and Adam an opportunity to open with some comments. And so let me hand over first to you, Mitch.
Thank you, Martin. I guess in the time that I have, I'll give a gloss of the paper and the motivations that led me to think about this subject matter. I began university education as a community college student, worked my way on up to University of California at Santa Cruz, did an MA in philosophy at San Jose State, and then now I'm here doing this PhD. And during my community college years, I noticed, not exclusively, but the student body was more so lower middle class on down to working class. Many, maybe even most of the professors had PhDs, which should have been my first clues to the economic or the job prospects of newly minted PhDs in academia. And then as I went on, at a four-year university at Santa Cruz, and then at this PhD program here at the University of Minnesota, I noticed the demographics of the student body change. It was no longer working in lower middle class, it was more upper middle class on above. And particularly when I got to the University of Minnesota in the graduate department, particularly in mine, but more broadly in the humanities and social sciences, everyone is doing left-oriented work, broadly construed, whatever it is. And yet at the same time, the student body that populates those graduate programs, not exclusively so, but tend to be upper middle class on above. So I began thinking about this tension of what it means to claim that a department is ostensibly left-wing, progressive, maybe liberal, while at the same time the class composition of the university being one that is disproportionately in service to an economic elite. So some of the data that I provided there, some of the studies, something like off the top of my head, the University of Minnesota, the bottom economic quintile is represented in 3.5% of the total student body, while 50% of the student body comes from the wealthiest economic quintile. And the study pulled anonymized tax records of the parents of students, undergraduate students that attend colleges and universities all over the nation. And it's important that it's the parents' tax data because on paper, most, if not all, college students are poor. So I began thinking of this tension, and oddly, I thought the composition part would be uncontroversial. It's just raw quantitative data of who populates the university. But I discovered that even talking with academics and broaching this reality made them kind of uncomfortable, as if it's a truth that they don't want to be confronted with or be made aware of. But in addition, the other parts of the paper deal with debt and then managerialism. So in terms of debt, what I propose in the paper is that debt serves as this mechanism that channels students in the university into a two-tiered structure. So I think Adam and I hit on the same point, that those that come from economic means typically don't take out loans to pursue their undergraduate and perhaps graduate studies thereafter. Whereas those that come from the lower middle class on down tend to have to take out these student loans, and these loans saddle with burden them later on to life. And as I claim with by leaning on Maurizio Lazzarato, it kind of disciplines them into a subject that kind of constrains their economic mobility, as well as what they consider in terms of their own job prospects, namely that they have the paying down of that debt as an ultimate goal. Looking at how the university maintains its own self-perception as liberal, progressive, perhaps in some departments left-wing, I look at Catherine Liu's work, but also people like Thomas Frank, and contend that much of this is by framing the politics through the lens of identity politics, while forsaking a class-based orientation. So I look at people like Adolf Reed and Walter Ben Michaels, who make the claim that identity politics is not an alternative to class politics. It is a form of class politics in and of itself that serves to re-entrench class interests, while making those class interests appear relatively opaque, benign, or even lied over them altogether. So the general arc of the paper is, you have a examination of the class composition of the university, an examination of the way that debt serves to kind of mark those that are able to enter it, from the working poor, the working class, the lower middle class, and then how the university is still able to paint itself as operating within the interest of the marginalized and those that are regarded as, pardon me, as an identity class. So, the general monikers or the general mantra of race, gender, sexuality, on down the list. One, I guess to conclude, the way I teach my students this is I'll kind of put up one of those signs that says, kind of see them in cupcake shops or farm to table restaurants or grocery store co-ops that say, we welcome you regardless of your, and then there's a list of race, religion, sexual orientation, straight on down. And they kind of get it now, but in years past I'd ask, who is absent here? Who is absent from this list? And they'd kind of be dumbfounded. And then within the past few years, more quickly, they'll say, it makes no mention of, they might not say class, but economic status, or, it doesn't mention the poor, something like this. And I would say you're right, and that the implicit message is that this is sort of a neoliberal or even progressive form of acceptance that kind of erases class, but accepts everyone who is able to financially pay for the goods and services. That includes the university itself, except that a large percentage of those that come through the university halls are only able to pay through this mechanism of debt. And as recent moves by the Trump administration have shown, the burden of debt is becoming even more draconian as the debt becomes due and forgiveness is off the table, and capitalization is incurred upon unpaid debts. So that's the general arc of the paper. And, I was thinking of, as I was rereading this, I was reading Adam's paper, and I was like, oh, well, there's a lot of overlap here. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that unfolds throughout the conversation.
Great, thank you, Mitch. Yeah, so let's turn to Adam for some opening comments too.
Thank you. Thank you for asking us to do this. I remember when Mitch was presenting, because we both presented our papers at the class conference at BGSU, where I've been adjuncting for a few years now. And I remember reading through his paper, even just the title description and the abstract, and I was like, this is actually sort of a variation of the paper that I'm giving. So similar to Mitch, my background in education, I come from, working class, family in rural Ohio, and my father was like a working class intellectual, I guess you could say. He grew up in the 70s, right at a time when Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance came out. He was a teenager, and he got really interested in philosophy and literature. And, he ended up getting his degree when I was, 8 or 9 years old or something. But he was the only person in our family to have any sort of formal kind of higher education. And, there wasn't much by way of like thinking about higher education as something I ought to do. Like when I went to a state school here in Ohio, because it was close by. I mean, this is what a lot of working class kids do. They go someplace close because they don't want to be too far from their family, because that's their sort of network, so their support network. And I sort of took after my father. I really wanted to be an intellectual. I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to be a writer, and I sort of bought into a lot of these what became, I guess you could say, very liberal narratives about education. And I was sort of a true believer in education as like the means for my own social mobility. Like this was how I was going to succeed in life. And my father passed away very young during my final year of college, and I remember telling myself, well, I'm gonna apply to creative writing programs to sort of fulfill his dream of becoming a writer, because he was always talking about writing a book, writing a memoir, writing a novel. And I got accepted to some, and sort of to my surprise, honestly. And you're 22 years old, and they're dangling this carrot in front of you that says, hey, come to this really prestigious private university in New York. It was Sarah Lawrence College in New York, which at the time I had never even really heard of Sarah Lawrence College. I was just told that it was like a good place to go for creative writing. But it was, I don't remember the exact cost. It was probably $50,000 or $60,000 in student debt. But I was told, don't worry, with that degree, you're going to publish a book, you're going to get good jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And of course I graduated. I entered that program right when the financial crisis happened. And, jobs in the humanities, basically, if you look at the data, English openings were halved basically by 2010. The number of openings just went down 50%, and they've only been going down since. And, and so then I left. I came back to Ohio afterwards. I was working in New York for a bit, but I lost my job, and I came home, and then I did an MA in philosophy, mostly out of boredom, and honestly to continue deferring my student loan payments, because if you're in school, you can continue to defer your student loan payments. It was my little I thought, if I can just stay in school forever, I'm never going to have to pay this stuff back, And then I did my PhD at UIC, where I studied with Walter Ben Michaels, and obviously his influence is kind of evident in a lot of my paper. So I graduated, I got my PhD right when COVID happened. I was on the job market, and I, found myself kind of butting up against the sort of inclusion into this kind of guild of like academia. I came so close so many times, getting these tenure track jobs, like finalist, all of these kinds of situations. And, I really began thinking about the function of higher education within the larger kind of, class structure. Because as someone who didn't come from, a privileged background by any means, and, certainly I came from a family who thought well, you have a PhD. I don't understand. Why can't you just teach? That was their understanding, is why don't they give you a job? And I always sort of felt like I had one foot in academia, where I sort of belonged, but there was also this sense in which I never really felt like I quite fully belonged in academia. I was marked in some way, they could kind of sense that I wasn't really one of them. And maybe there's some truth to that. But nevertheless, I began working on sort of variations of this research. A couple years ago, I was on a panel at AWP with Daniel and Catherine Liu, and we, did a paper, and our colleague Nori was also there, and we did a paper on graduate student debt. And I was thinking a lot about graduate student debt as someone who has a lot of graduate student debt, and that sort of evolved into thinking about just the role of graduate student debt and the financial kind of component of the financialization of higher education. And last year or the year before, I wrote a paper for the Brooklyn Rail, or an article for the Brooklyn Rail, on legacy admissions. I think it was called like Legacy Admissions and the Myth of Social Mobility. I'd read Gary Roth's book. I know Gary Roth was a speaker for you guys, on higher education. And, it kind of confirmed a lot of what I was thinking about with higher education, which is that, a lot of the data that kind of supports, and becomes the sort of claim in my paper, a lot of the data that supports, social mobility, people say, well, education is the way forward. It's the way you, kind of lift yourself up out of poverty, or this is how you sort of, secure a middle-class life. The reality is that the vast majority of people, like if you, look at the data, the vast majority of people in the bottom quintile of income earners, which of course is not always the best marker of class, but it is, I think, a fairly useful metric. The poorest among us are going, the vast majority, almost half of them don't even enroll in college, right? So the starting point for who is entering college is already sort of is being lifted up. And so that data is heavily skewed, and it gets even more skewed as you start looking at, elite institutions like Harvard and Yale and places like this. So I began thinking about what function higher education has. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that, in fact, contrary to the claim that education is, the way, the avenue for securing, some sort of financial livelihood, that its primary function is to reproduce existing inequality. And it does so via, in the ways that kind of Mitch already talks about, obviously the financial, the indebtedness aspect of it, but also through, I think, an important kind of ideological function, which is the rationalization of inequality as a byproduct of like natural endowments. In the paper, I quote Barron and Sweezy and their, monopoly capital. And I think that for me, that, as someone who I think at one point sort of believed in that argument, that like, oh, I'm really smart and that's what matters, right? I'm clever and I'm smart, and that'll kind of like get me where I need to go. And of course, the reality was anything but that. And so I guess you could say I became sort of disillusioned with that narrative, and began to kind of think about the way it was actually functioning. And it was primarily functioning as a way to kind of rationalize the system. And also, I think it becomes a way of like, gatekeeping the job market, right? If like the good jobs are the jobs that you have to, that you get because, you need a certain kind of qualification or a certain skill set that can only get you, or that you can only get through a kind of education, well, then suddenly education becomes this sort of, I guess you could say, a player in the job market in this very crucial way that sort of rationalizes and perpetuates certain kinds of inequality. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the gist of the paper. I get into data about graduate student debt and things like that, which we can talk about. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to kind of opening the discussion up and having a larger conversation about this.
Great, thank you, Adam. We thought it might be useful as a way of opening up the discussion to given that Mitch and Adam have read each other's papers and that there's quite a bit of overlap and there are connections between the themes of their papers and so on, to give each of them a chance to raise questions that they have for each other, not so that they can then immediately go into an extended back and forth, because we want to open it up for everyone, but if they could each have a chance to raise questions that they might particularly want to raise for each other, or mention themes that they think it might be particularly helpful for us to discuss and so on, and then we can open up for questions from anyone who's here. So Mitch, would you like to go first with that?
Yeah, I was thinking of this concluding paragraph in Adam's paper, and I think in my opening paragraph or somewhere in there, there's a line of Raymond Williams where he describes in keywords, the key term is liberal arts, and he says, liberal arts has historically been a class term to mark, the the education of a moneyed elite. And in Adams' concluding paragraph, there's the suggestion that, as tuition balloons and as the amount of student debt that one has to take out to attend a college or university increases, that there's a strong possibility that one will just simply not regard it as a viable investment, and that there's a possibility that the university will completely return to its class origins. And I was wondering, that's definitely one possibility, but I'm also wondering if there'd be a two-tiered system where the poor, lower middle class on down don't attend liberal arts universities, but are relegated, and I kind of want to use that term in air quotes, to technical colleges or colleges that are career oriented, and how that might be, how ideologically, how those colleges would be looked at. If it'd be a way to just kind of regard universities that offer a liberal arts education soberly, and to think of them maybe cynically, and that might be a catalyst for working class resentment, to kind of discount the sort of knowledge production that comes out of those universities, or if the universities will just continue on as they have and kind of regard those that go to technical colleges as unthinking, unlearned, and they'll be shut out from policy discussions and the like.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's something I think about a lot. I will say it's interesting, as someone, and maybe you kind of have this experience too, where as someone who I think has become very critical of higher education, which I have, and at least in its current kind of format, I nevertheless am still committed to higher education as like a public good. And that would sort of involve like a kind of liberal arts education. And so it's always tricky, like critiquing it without, wanting to come across as sort of anti-intellectual. But I will say one thing, there's a couple things that I will say in regard to that. So I mentioned that I've been adjuncting, for a couple of years, and as anybody knows, adjunct pay is atrocious, especially at like a regional state university, which is where I adjunct. And so to supplement my income, I worked for a couple of years at Lowe's Home Improvement, driving a forklift in the outside lawn and garden section. And so it was a lot of fun. And in a lot of ways, I'm always thinking about going back to the job. I'm always like, I kind of want to go back. And my wife is always like, you don't want to go back. And I'm like, well, maybe I kind of do actually. Because there's something sort of very freeing about that kind of work. As menial as it is, there's something weird, oddly kind of comforting in it. But while I was there, I became friends with a lot of people who work who were not college educated, and we would often talk about it. They would sometimes joke and they would call me professor, and I would always be like, I'm not really a professor. And we would kind of chit chat, and I'd always be like, especially the younger ones, cashiers who are like 18, 19, 20. And I would always be like, do you go to school? And they always say, overwhelmingly, they would say, no, I can't afford it. I'm not really going to go. I don't really see the point. Right. And so that was one thing I really began to think about, like, wow, I can't imagine, or maybe I did have that experience 20 years ago, but it seemed like, in the early 2000s when I was applying, or when I was graduating high school, that that sort of hostility toward and maybe sort of cynicism toward college education was not as prevalent, at least not among my social circles. But the other thing I will say is that right now, like in a lot of high schools, there is already a kind of two-tiered structure, right? So I don't know if you guys have this, at your high schools, but at our high school we had basically a vocational program where they kind of quietly ushered in, students who were maybe, less skilled or, less, who performed, poorly into vocational programs where they would learn trades, right? They would learn carpeting, or they would learn hairdressing, or these kinds of things. And as a 16-year-old, I never really thought much about why the high school was doing this and what function that was serving. But it was already kind of serving a sort of funneling, people into their respective, classes based on some sort of ostensible natural endowment that we've decided that a 16-year-old possesses for some reason. But to your point, I think, thinking about the future of higher education, I think that the two-tiered system is actually one way that I could see sort of happening, because if you look at a lot of the data, especially aside from rising tuition costs that are placing a heavy strain on attendance and pushing down attendance rates, the other big problem is that there's this looming demographic cliff, right? Birth rates have been declining pretty much every year since the early 2000s, or 2006 or 7 or something. So all of these people who would now be going to college, there's the pool of them is shrinking dramatically over the next 15 years. And so what the data shows is that tuition dependent colleges, so this is primarily colleges that do not have much of an endowment, and this is a lot of private liberal arts colleges, regional private liberal arts colleges that have maybe 1,000 students, 1,500 students, D3 kind of sports schools, that those are going to be hit the hardest, that they're going to have the hardest time kind of surviving this period of uncertainty. So I think that if that is the case, and you see a lot of these kind of private liberal arts colleges closing, what you will be left with are, maybe big state universities, Ivy League kind of colleges, obviously, which, are going to be just fine, regardless of what they may say otherwise. And then community colleges, assuming that, people still want to go to community college. But I think that, community college is, I think, where a lot of people do sort of pursue kind of a trade. Nursing is a big program for a lot of community colleges, right? The sort of degree granting, or certificate granting, like, if you have a certificate of nursing, you can then go get a job nursing, right? That's not the case with other kinds of my degree in English doesn't give me a certificate to English to teach English, unfortunately. I mean, it gives me a certain kind of qualification, but I'm not guaranteed or sort of able to access the labor market in the way that someone with like a kind of vocational degree is. I don't know, did that answer your, I'm kind of riffing on some of your points here, but I guess the central point I wanted to make is that I do think that given where things are going, that kind of two-tiered system is possible. And I think that if that were the case, I think you're right. I think that like the kind of ideological and kind of cultural resentment that people have toward the Ivy League would certainly be exacerbated in that sense.
Great. So that also seemed to touch on one of the questions I think you were meaning to raise, Adam, about what higher education as a public good would look like. But would you like to pick a question that you want to raise for Mitch, and whilst that's going on, other people can start to put themselves in the queue if they have questions.
Actually, one thing that I want to talk about, and because I think this is a thorny question that I would love to get Mitch's opinion on this. So, given that we both are sort of looking at the data about who attends colleges, right? And the data about who attends colleges, especially like, state universities and things like this, that it's not the poorest of the poor who are attending these colleges, right? That there's a sort of, there's already sort of like a built-in self-selection process for who decides to pursue college in the first place, right? So when you think about graduates or, student debt, generally speaking, one of the criticisms that people have towards student debt is that it would essentially amount to a kind of handout to the professional class. And this is an argument that I've never quite known what to do with. Because on the one hand, there's something kind of right about it, but on the other hand, I think there's something sort of misguided and kind of wrong about it. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that kind of claim and about that argument, given the kind of class composition of universities and the function of debt, generally speaking.
Yeah, I kind of had a generous and unique experience going through my studies. I grew up in California, so I, coming from a low income, let's putting it generously, family, I didn't have to pay a dime for going through community college, going through my undergraduate studies at Santa Cruz, and including my master's, which I still to this day think was a clerical error of some sort because my buddy went from the same economic background and he had to take out loans to get the same degree. Um, and then, obviously the PhD is funded, and I've become very wealthy, with the stipend that I collect every year doing the PhD. But many of the people that I know that have exorbitant student debt, I mean, they're lawyers or other professional occupations where, so the argument goes, their investment does have the return such that, well, why would you expect us taxpayers to bail you out? Um, but I still think the argument holds that by and large, those that do have to take out those loans, of course, there's going to be exceptions, but tend to be those that don't come from the wealthiest families of the nation. Um, I do think that there is, space for suspicion in terms of, well, especially if we're just going to bail out so-called student loan holders, is that just going to enable universities to say, oh, okay, well, now we have the right to raise tuition because we are being ever more subsidized by the federal government? So I think ultimately, on the one hand, loan forgiveness is a formidable policy, but it has to be coupled with some accountability that's levied upon the universities themselves. And in one way, I think it might be coming at it from the wrong angle, but this threat of taking away the tax exempt or extremely low taxation of endowments could be one way to get universities to become more frank and honest about their tuition and fee increases.
Great, thanks, Mitch. Sam, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you both for coming to talk to us. And apropos of not much, Adam, I'm really interested in, I think you said it was your thesis on kind of the literature, the class nature of literature and who's writing and who's reading. But as you guys were talking, I was thinking about the cost of universities and my understanding is that a big contribution to the increasing cost of higher education is administrative bloat. Um, and I guess I'm interested in if you see a link between the growth in the administration of these colleges and the increasing percentage of college graduates who are underemployed or not employed in their fields. Uh, Kind of a leading question, but is the increasing, administrative burden on these universities basically just workfare for the clerics, I think is the word that you use, Adam. Um, these non-STEM college educated people who don't have jobs offered to them.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't really thought of it that way, but I do think that that's a very um, compelling way of thinking about the administrative bloat. That in a sense that the university is sort of carving out a space within itself to kind of keep people in the fold, right? To not just cast them off into, because it is true, right? I mean, if you look at the data, and this is another thing that I think about in the paper is that, college degrees are certainly not a guarantee of a good job in the way that they once were. If they have ever really been that much of an indicator of a good job to begin with, given the fact that, as we kind of discussed, that people who get good jobs tend to come from wealthier backgrounds and are good at networking, and they have a certain capacity for navigating the job market that people from working class backgrounds don't necessarily always get. but it is, I think one of the data points that I talk about in the paper is that so declining, attendance rates declined by, I think it was like 15% from 2010 to 2020, while tuition rates, even holding for inflation, increased by 15 to 20% during that same time. So the idea that there's some sort of like demand that's like a sort of supply demand problem, I think is erroneous. And actually, if you look at the growth in admin, right, since like the 70s, it's like a 450% increase in administrative and quote unquote other professionals. And of course, I think that does play a crucial role in the cost burden that students have to take on, because if you are a university, and this isn't, I think people at universities, people who work at universities, they believe in the mission of like higher education. You know what I mean? I think they genuinely believe that they're doing something very good. And my wife is an academic librarian, and she, I think she's a little bit jaded like I am, but nevertheless, we navigate academic circles, and our a lot of our friends are in those circles, and so there's certainly a lot of like well-meaning individuals who believe that like the university and the goals of universities are noble, but I think to your point, the kind of larger financial structure and the financial incentives of like it looks good for a university to say this number of our students are fully employed after graduating, right? You don't want to like be a university and are publishing your rates of your graduation student rates, saying like, well, only 10% of our students go on to get a good job, then nobody's going to want to come to your college anywhere, right? So I think that there is this sort of like Ouroboros kind of aspect of it's like it's like almost like eating itself, like you get people in, you give them a degree, and then you bring them back in. And I think that's especially true where I'm, at the university where I've been adjuncting. So many of the sort of administrative professionals and even the faculty are people who got their degrees at that university. So I think that there is certainly like I think that is one element to the equation for sure.
And if I could add a note there as well, there was some mention earlier on of one of the themes that's come up is the role of identity politics in the academy, right? And I think it plays many roles, in fact, some of which have been mentioned, but this I think might be another one, namely, DEI officers provide employment for people with college degrees, essentially, right? It would be good to look into this. I think probably look at numbers, like how many jobs are there out there really that are sort of administrative jobs in universities, and how much are they addressing the problem of people with college degrees who can't find jobs that require college degrees, the jobs that they paid for, as it were. But anyway, there is certainly something to look into there, at least, I guess.
I can share some links. I wasn't distracted, obviously, but I was doing some brief research while during this conversation. The Fed has numbers on underemployment among college graduates, and there's a bunch of less authoritative information on the growth in administrative offices within universities that corresponds with that.
Yeah, one of the tricky things, and this is like if you get into reading a lot of the literature on higher education and what is like broadly called like critical university studies, the reporting, like the sort of financial reporting of universities is very opaque, and it's often really hard to kind of get a handle on some of the things that you would really love to know, like in detail, like the kinds of questions that we're asking about, what percentage of these students, or what percentage of these jobs can we say have increased due to kind of these changes. And it's not always easy to find that data. But I also think, to your point, back to sort of what Mitch was saying just briefly, lawyers, being a lawyer is like, what I think growing up, I'm like a child of the 90s, and like making lawyer jokes was like the quintessential thing that you did in the 1990s. You made fun of lawyers. Jurassic Park, the only one who is on my side is the blood-sucking lawyer, that kind of classic line. But my good friend was a lawyer, and he was he struggled greatly. He had a lot of debt. He also had a chronic illness, but it was very difficult for him to find work and to find meaningful work, even with a law degree. So I think that even some of the professions that we think of as being a kind of good return on investment, like, yeah, you take out these loans, but you're going to get the kind of the salary that will hopefully kind of assuage that cost burden, are not even they're not even because there's this sort of glut of lawyers, right? A lot of people became lawyers and paraprofessionals. And then I think the other aspect to student loans that people often neglect, or we kind of often forget to think about, is the number of people who take out loans but then don't even finish college, right? There's a lot of people who go to school for a year or two and then just they don't go because they can't, right? Because they have family that they have to take care of, or because they have other kinds of responsibilities, or because they just feel like they don't belong there. And so then suddenly you have debt, and then you don't even have the degree that is ostensibly meant to give you the sort of path for the good, the good job that'll help pay that debt back. So that was just another little thing that I thought I would bring up.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this notion how debt serves to discipline the subject, if you will. And I was briefly reading, I forget, was it David that shared the Melinda Cooper paper? And Melinda Cooper is talking about the Higher Education Act 1965 and the GI Bill before that allowed greater access to higher education, and how this culminated in student protests during the 60s. And Milton Friedman suggested that one way to tamper down this angst of students was to return it to the site of the family and to treat it as an investment. We should be less generous with Pell Grants and so forth. And this will allow students to see education for what it truly is, an investment in the self. And so thinking about debt now and lawyers, and my buddy and I at UC Santa Cruz, he was a TA at the time. He'd have these students saying, I want to go into law. And he'd say, these kids, they have cell phones. Why can't they just Google, like how much debt do I have to take out to become a lawyer? Because they envision themselves as going into environmental law or public defender or immigration law, which ultimately just simply won't pay back the debt. So if they want to end up being able to do that, they quickly adjust, their aims from environmental or immigration law to doing corporate law or copyright law or something like this, that just kind of make sure that they reinscribe themselves into keeping up the system of corporate power.
Yeah, thanks. One thing, just as a quick sort of footnote to this discussion, is I don't have it ready to hand, unfortunately, but I think there is pretty good data on, like, for example, the percentage of people who have a college, 4-year degree, and what percentage of those people are in jobs that required a 4-year degree, 5 years later or 10 years later or something. And it's, those numbers are quite startling too. So a question that I was going to ask is, perhaps, this is a question for both of you, but perhaps especially for Adam, because you mentioned that you started to think that the sort of the end, the telos, the function of higher education is to perpetuate inequality, to keep certain inequalities in place. And you use the word inequality I think in your opening remarks. In the paper, though, you also talk about class relations, which are kind of different, not unrelated, but a different thing. And I just wondered if you could say more about that, because I could think of lots of different ways that higher education might serve to help to maintain, perpetuate a certain kind of class structure, for example, by producing what, for want of a better term, what we might call a PMC, a professional managerial class, right? By producing a PMC, certifying them, training them, something like that, if that counts as a class, which is a debate in itself. Maybe by maintaining a distinction between these different fractions of what we might call the working class, right? The ones who have college degrees and the ones who don't, by indebting people, you mentioned. I'm also curious about whether higher education serves, do we need higher education to produce a capitalist class? Do you need a degree to be a member of the capitalist class? Certainly the financial class, I guess, would at least typically do have degrees. But anyway, so if you have any more thoughts about any of that, about the idea of higher education as having the function of reproducing a certain kind of class structure, that if you have more thoughts about that, that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of, you kind of, I think, stated very, very succinctly a lot of the thoughts that I have about the ways in which it reproduces, class relations and, class inequality. Because I think that, and this goes back to thinking about who attends college and which colleges do they attend, right? Because, Harvard will make a big deal about opening, giving free tuition to anybody who's making less than, I don't know what it is now. I think they raised it now to 200,000, anyone making less than $200,000, right? Which certainly sounds nice, but you have to think that what their acceptance rate is like 4%, right? So maybe a couple hundred kids are going to maybe benefit from this, right? So the idea that like these measures are actually doing anything is sort of laughable on its face. Because the whole point of, the reason that Harvard is elite is precisely, in one sense, precisely because it's so exclusive. So I think that your point to the sort of professional managerial class, I think, is really important, because I think that the university is precisely where this kind of nebulous professional middle class, lots of contention on whether or not they're a subset of the working class, whether or not they're going to be their own kind of class, right? But individuals who work by and large in industries, like as the Ehrenreichs would describe it, industries that are in some ways involved with the production and reproduction of ideology, right? So education, media, law, these kinds of professions, right? And so, if you are a member, as many of us ostensibly are or have striven to be, part of going through that training is, I think, is rationalizing your place in that hierarchy, right? Because in some ways you need that hierarchy to work for you. I think that, one of the questions I mentioned in the email that I sent to Mitch and to you, Martin, and I wanted to open this up to discussion, and I guess I could bring it up now because I think it's very relevant, so I've been reading this book, We Have Never Been Woke by Musa Al-Gharbi. And I'm actually going to be writing a kind of review essay of it. And I came across this section on Occupy Wall Street. Do you guys mind if I just read this short paragraph to you about his understanding of it? Because I think this touches on your point. I think it's a really provocative and compelling way of thinking about the kind of the ways in which class relations are sort of reproduced and obscured in this way. So he says, in reality, Occupy was not class-oriented. It was a movement that, if anything, helped obscure important class differences in the actual causes of social stratification. As David Autor aptly put it, the singular focus of the public debate on the, quote, top 1% of households overlooks the component of earnings inequality that is arguably the most consequential for the other 99% of citizens, namely the dramatic growth in the wage premium associated with higher education and cognitive ability. That is precisely what Occupy helped us avoid talking about, is how symbolic economy institutions in their employment practices are some of the main drivers of contemporary inequality, and how people like us are the primary, quote, winners of this arrangement. And I think that, framing, he actually talks about how, that Occupy in some ways is the sort of birth and the kind of instantiation of this sort of great awakening of the last 15 years as we've seen it. And he traces the term woke. I think he has a kind of compelling genealogical argument of the term. But I think that there's something very compelling about that argument, because as someone who has navigated and been a part of academic spaces for almost half my life now, as a student and as an educator, I do find it sort of plausible that there's a sort of complacency built into the structure of these institutions, for people who have made it, right? Like once you have made it, and you have tenure, or if you have a good job in the media or something, then the idea that you are going to meaningfully challenge class relations is sort of dubious, because you need those class relations for your very like that's your job depends on those class relations existing and continuing to exist, right? And I think that like one of the things you've seen with Twitter, right, and X, and Elon Musk buying it as a sort of digital commons, right? I think this, in some ways, this is a kind of a response to that very idea, that there's a sort of guild or a kind of stratification of like who controls the narrative and who gets to say what. Now, I don't think that it's a very good way of responding, and I don't think it certainly produced anything meaningful. But nevertheless, I think that the kind of emotional and kind of political cathexis, as you might say, that's like attached to that, has a very real source of, I think, frustration for people, because they see these institutions, the media, education, as being complicit in these kinds of structures.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Adam. You had a question? Are you?
Yeah, I do have a question, and I apologize if I start to rant a little bit. So this is just sort of forming in my head. I'm trying to relate the ideas I'm hearing from both of you to uh, all of the events that class unity has been having about political economy, in which, in my view, that the prevailing narrative is the story about the American economy, which involves a period of industrialization followed by a period of financialization. And it seems to me that the story of higher education is just one example or one piece of this broader story of the slow and sure decline of American empire. And so in the earlier period of industrialization, it was important not to invest in industry, but to invest in higher education, because you need a managerial class to manage all the industry. And as we've seen, the decline, the decline of industry in the United States, or the disinvestment and privatization of the whole American economy. We've seen disinvestment in the education system. The product is also has been in decline. And from what I can tell, I think the quality of education you get today is nothing compared to like a liberal arts education you would get in, I don't know, the 50s. I don't know. I wasn't alive back then. So I wonder, with the current trajectory of the United States, with the rise of its global competitors who are investing in industry and also in higher education, I wonder if the international allure of the U.S. higher education system is going away, and as the university continues to fail to live to its promise of social mobility that it used to have, that it used to be able to meet, isn't the higher education system in America just going to be completely like delegitimated entirely and collapse? Isn't that where we're headed?
I mean, it's certainly possible. I mean, I don't know. I feel like I've been hogging the conversation.
I don't imagine so. I mean, returning to the administrative bloat, it still seems that the university is still able to produce people to fill these positions that dominate to use Basin superstructure, the ideological superstructure, and generate meaning in terms of the national society. I was thinking about administrative bloat, and I think the conservative angle is get rid of these administrators, stop admitting students that don't display the merit to be there, and return education to this sort of elite-centered mission. But another angle would be, instead of having a 400 some odd percent increase in administrators, what if that became, a 100, 200% increase in tenure track professors?
Mhm.
So it didn't have to go this angle, but I think the managerialism has the task of, how to put it, undoing the possibilities that are inherent within a classic liberal arts education, and making it more instrumental rather than a critique of society at large. And then I guess one more comment on the what Adam was talking about is that we, insofar as we make it within the university, and I think Adam and myself probably aren't included in that population, but insofar as those that do make it sort of become invested in upholding the university, I'm kind of given over to Chomsky's propaganda model here, where the general thesis is that those that enter into halls of power, whether it's the media, education, the State Department, and so forth, it's not like they have to be brainwashed. They actually believe in advance in the qualifications and missions for which they're hired for. And the reason why the other people are filtered out is they just aren't going to advance the mission of administrations kind of dressed in DEI or identity or what have you. So there are other angles in which the university can reestablish itself on a universalist model. But even forbidding that, I don't think that it'll kind of delegitimize itself. I think it'll just return to the domain of an elite and still hold itself as an institution that grants social and cultural capital to that group.
Yeah, I would wanted to follow up on this couple of aspects of this issue too. Just first to expand on what you were saying, Vestian, during the period of sort of high industrialization in the States, it wasn't just a managerial class, I take it, it's that we also really needed, engineers, scientists, and so on, right? That they played a crucial role in the ongoing sort of development of industry, and that was something universities did well. Then when we get to the sort of period where financialization takes over, I was reminded when I was reading Adams and Mitch's papers about both of which talk about debt and the role that the sort of student loan system plays in our current configuration, the current configuration of the higher education system in the US. That back when we were talking about, when we had our course last year on the global financial crisis, we read Kostas Lapavitsas talking about what he calls financial expropriation, the growth of the extraction. So this is the quote from him: the extraction of financial profits directly out of personal income. And now we were focusing on mortgages, but he also mentions student loan debt as another aspect of this, right? That as industry declines and you've got a financial sector that's trying to find ways to make money, student loans is one way to do that. But then as a last comment, just on your question about the future, Hef, I mean, so at the moment, there's no, at least I don't yet know of a sign of a decline in status of the American system of higher education. And one way you can see that is that a lot of American universities are very, universities, especially of a certain sort of prestige, depend a lot on international students, and that, of course, has been in the news recently, because international students and perhaps and especially Chinese students from China come and pay full tuition and pay quite a lot of money, and that's a big part of the financial model for a certain kind of college and university at the moment, and which is part of why there's such a panic around, what Trump's trying to block international students enrolling at Harvard recently and so on. So at the moment, there still seems to be that prestige, but it's a separate question what the future holds. Dominic Adam, did you want to?
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to can I just make a quick point about what Hef was saying in the chat, actually? Because I think, one thing I was thinking about as we were talking.
Perhaps you could tell us what Hef was saying in the chat.
So Hef says, it seems to me that the university's primary legitimating force is a functional job market with meaningful employment prospects to justify a degree, and this is more or less outside the university's control. And one of the things I was thinking about, I don't really know that if there's data on this, or I haven't really looked into it seriously, but one of the things I've always thought about, or have begun to think about increasingly with the university, is, let's say, I don't know how many people are enrolled in a university right now in America. It's 30, 40 million students. Maybe, I don't know how many students it is. It's a lot. Maybe that's too high. But the point is what if, let's imagine like a sort of counterfactual where suddenly there is no university and all of those people would be on the job market. Because one of the things that the university does for 4 years is it allows people to not be on the job market, and it keeps unemployment rates artificially low because you have people who are in school, right? So they don't really count as being unemployed. And I think that's like a very interesting sort of function that intentionally or otherwise that the university has come to serve. It does a kind of job training for companies and for the job market, right? You do your training elsewhere so that the company doesn't have to pay you to train you. Like you have to pay yourself to get trained for the job that you want to get, right? And of course, you're in school, right? So you're not unemployed. The economy's great, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just think that I would love to know more about how those kind of statistics hash out, because that to me, I think, is a really compelling and interesting aspect to what higher education does.
Dominic, you have a question?
Yeah, just some thoughts that were rattling around in my head as I was hearing you talk. Just curious about your thoughts on these thoughts. And these might be a little bit outside of your expertises, but I'll ask anyhow. So just a couple of things I've been noticing over the last, I don't know, handful of years. Well, one that I'm noticing a heck of a lot right now is liberals who are very vehemently defending Harvard and other private elite universities who are being attacked by Trump. And the things that I'm seeing and hearing them say is that there's all these working class people who go there, and it's actually like a really good way to get working class people out of poverty and get them into the elite sphere and all this stuff. And I just like, it seems so like a lot of cognitive dissonance to me. And there's also at the same time, I feel like this has slowed down a bit, but over the last decade and a half, especially, a real excoriating from liberals of people who don't have college degrees and aren't pursuing higher education, especially the men who aren't, and sort of blaming them for, well, if they want better jobs and they want, better social lives and stuff, then they need to, improve themselves and get the skills and stuff to get better jobs and whatever. And I'm just curious what you think about this. People who at one point would have been probably defending things more in line with leftist thinking, but now sort of just I don't know if it's reactionary against Trump. He's doing something, so we have to be against it. But it just seems kind of tied in with all this. So just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump thing is interesting. I mean, there's this like so sort of small part of me, like when he goes after Ivy League schools, like the little there's a part of me that thinks, well, okay, that's, I'm not going to get too mad because I don't really support those kinds of institutions. But I think that like Trump is motivated by a kind of broader cultural resentment. He's become a kind of, a vessel for this sort of resentment toward, cultural elites, right? And I think that like that sort of resentment is unproductive. Even if I sort of agree, even if I can kind of identify or understand its kind of sentiment. To your point about, why don't, men go to college? I do think what's really interesting and, thinking about, what I would want a university to do or what in my sort of ideal scenario where universities ought to go, aside from being, free or at very least, not cost prohibitive, if I'm going to set the bar, low. I think that universities need to be open enrollment. Like, I think that like this sort of what makes Harvard and what makes a lot of these institutions what they are is precisely because they are exclusive, right? And that exclusivity performs a certain kind of function that works in the favor for that's why those institutions are elite, right? But I think that one of the things that happened with education that I think that I would love to see changed is that education became so deeply interwoven with a career, with one's career. Like, you go to school and, well, you're at school, so what are you going to do for your career? Like, how is this degree going to help you get a job, right? And to me, I find that framing to be very unhelpful, because the way I see it, and maybe deep down, I'm too idealistic, but I do think that like the real function, the real sort of positive function of college is the socialization aspect. You go to college for 4 years after high school, right? It's where you gain some sense of independence from your parents, from your family, if you can. It's where you begin to navigate social circles. It's where you develop friendships. It's where you get to explore new ideas that maybe you wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise, if especially if you went to a high school that is underfunded or has a certain kind of curriculum. So that aspect of it, right? I mean, I sort of agree. I'm sort of like Deweyan in that sense, like education as as a sense of like you go there to discover oneself, right? It's a very liberal way of thinking about education, but deep down, I think it's a fine way to think about what education is and ought to be. And I think that like the sort of liberal kind of chastising of people without college degrees, it is kind of like ideological, like it's like a kind of cope almost, right? Like, at least I'm smarter than you, right? At least I have the right ideas, like I can't control the world. I can't control the fact that there's this guy in office who I don't like. I can't control that there's all of these ideas that I disagree with. And I wish people would just stop believing these things that I disagree with. But nevertheless, I can say that at least I have a college degree and I have the proper beliefs and proper attitudes towards certain ideas, right? So I think that like that I think has become a very powerful force within the kind of Trump resistance movement, because for them it's like I don't know if they can accept the reality of the situation, of like Trump's appeal and why Kamala Harris lost, and so. Yeah. I don't know. Mitch, do you want to jump in here and add anything?
Yeah, I mean, the resentment of Trump voters, it's almost like a counter resentment. They're responding to this disdain that they felt on behalf of a professional managerial class that's talked down to them, infantilized them for years and years. But Dominic, to your question, in terms of, liberals saying just go to college, get a better job, as picked up Thomas Frank here, and he has this chapter in Listen Liberal, where he's talking about how liberals and Democrats really doubled down on education as a vehicle for social mobility and what the function of that ultimately has. So I'll just read two short paragraphs. He writes, there is a sense in which it is obviously true, a platitude even, none of us would get very far if we didn't know how to read or do math. Research and development is indeed important. People have to have the right skills before they can run the big machinery. That much is obvious. But it doesn't take an advanced degree to figure out that this education talk is less a strategy for mitigating inequality than it is a way for rationalizing it. To attribute economic results to school years finished and SAT scores achieved is to remove matters from the realm of, economics and relocate them to provinces of personal striving and individual intelligence. So I think the point that he's getting at here is, what Trump has done quite well, I think, is co-opt this language that used to, particularly in the 2016 campaign, belong to the domain of someone like Bernie Sanders, and use it to kind of usher in an assault on higher education without including, any of the universal social programs that someone like Bernie Sanders would advocate for. And then what remains of the Democratic Party doesn't have anything imaginative to offer so much as the repetition of, I think, these tropes that are at bottom quite conservative in nature, kind of transferring systemic economic issues onto the individual in order to rationalize a system marked by strong inequality.
Yeah, thanks. So one, as we've already mentioned, of course, student debt is one theme that both of you talk about. And I wondered, Adam, you talk in particular about, you use the term neo-feudal or neo-feudalism at a certain point in your paper. And which is a little provocative and interesting. And I wanted to ask you if you'd be willing to expand on that a little bit. I mean, presumably the idea is that you're seeing some kind of analogy between the current system of higher education and the student debt system that surrounds it with kind of old-timey feudalism. So would you be willing to say more about what what you have in mind there as the analogy?
Yeah, I mean, so that it's an analogy that I don't know if I have totally fleshed out. As a peek behind the curtain, I will say, like, some of that language comes from the fact that the first version of this paper was presented at a conference that was called "The Future of Capitalism," quote, neo-feudalism, right? Right. So there was a sort of shoehorning of the feudalist language into it as a way of being like, I want to talk about what I want to talk about. It's feudalism, right? So, but I do think that, I think I referenced Joel Kotkin in that, in the paper. He talks about the sort of the modern day clerisy, right? And the function of the clerisy as sort of like absolving people of their sins, for having the wrong ideas and the wrong beliefs and the wrong attitudes. But for me, if we are to think about the feudal structure, at least, being marked by rent in particular, and having to pay the landlord, right? There's something about, so the structure, one of the things that I think is really worth thinking about, and it always drives me insane when people make the claim, sort of the kind of conservative claim, which is, I knew what I was getting into when I got a mortgage for my house. Like, why didn't you know what you were doing when you got your degree, right? Took out all that money for your degree. You knew what you were, you knew what you were taking out, right? And there's a lot of problems with this argument, because on the one hand, number one, taking out $60,000 for a graduate degree is not dependent on your income. You don't have, they don't, I can't just get a mortgage, like no bank is just going to give me a mortgage without making sure that I can pay it back, right? Via, work statements. And I know this because my wife and I bought a house here in Ohio, and we had to use only her income because the lender was like, look, if we include your debt to income ratio, you have too much debt. You won't be approved for anything, So we had to use just my wife's income in order to get approved for a mortgage. The other aspect is mortgages. The way mortgage payments are structured is vastly different than the way student loans are structured, like a standard like personal loan, right? You have a 6%, 7% interest, and it's going to be collecting on whatever the balance is, no matter what that balance is. And I actually discovered recently that almost all of my interest, because I was in deferment for so long, because I was in school for so long, it became capitalized. So now it's all principal. And so now the interest is collecting on all of that, what was interest, right? So it's interest collecting on interest, right? It's not going to happen with a mortgage. With a mortgage standard structure, 30 years, you begin your payment, 80% of your payment is going toward interest, 20% is going toward principal. And every month that ratio changes so that ostensibly by the end of the term, the loan term, you're just paying off principal balance, right? There's no more interest. You paid off all the interest, right? And the other aspect, of course, is that we can resell our house if we decide we can't afford it. And that's something that you can't do. Yeah, no ability to refinance. Exactly. I can't refinance my loans, my student loans. And I can't borrow against it. My mom was able to borrow against her mortgage because she had enough sunk into it that the bank would then give her a loan, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So it's a completely different financial asset. And it's a financial asset that I think is sort of uniquely bleak in its kind of structure to pay off, because it is so. I mean, you hear about this constantly, right? I mean, on the one hand, the Department of Education is, to its credit, pretty good about working with people if you can't afford to lower your payment, but they don't actually care that like you're paying $200 every month and your balance is actually going up because your interest is still accruing, right? That doesn't matter. So you can pay $200 a month for 20 years and suddenly you owe twice as much as you did when the loan, sort of when you first took out the loan. So I just think that that entire structure, in the way that debt, I guess, is organized. And I guess, as Mitch talks about, as a kind of function of discipline, right? Because my entire adult life now, I have a son who's 8 months now, and it is really like, I'm just thinking like, on the one hand, I think I'm never going to pay it off. Like it just kind of exists in this world where like, whatever, it's just there. But on the other hand, I think it actually will, like if we ever wanted to like buy another house, if we moved, like that's something, even if I had a good job, like it would definitely impair my ability, to secure a certain asset like a house, right? So I think that like that structure of the debt, and it's a 20, 30-year loan, which is just crazy, is it in practice produces a kind of fealty to like the sort of your financial overlords in a way that like, I know, to me, it feels like even like credit card payment does not feel as bleak to me as student debt does. Student debt feels very uniquely sort of like doom and gloom. It's tough. It's tough. So that to me, and I think about like all of the downstream effects of having that debt, right? Well, I can't buy a house, so now I'm going to have to rent instead of own a house, right? So now I'm paying money to someone else, like a literal landlord. I even if I get a good paying job, suddenly they're going to take my debt, they're going to take my income, and they're going to say, well, now now I'm totally blanking on the term. What's the term? My income, my expendable income. That's the word I was thinking of, my expendable income, which is, some proportion of, whatever it is above the poverty rate. I don't remember what the exact calculation is. But now suddenly that's a lot larger. So like I get a good job, but suddenly they're going to be demanding I give them $1,000 a month. So like, okay, I get a good job, but it's immediately just going, it's like, I'm having let's say I get a job for some really cool, I sell out, right? In the sort of 90 cents, and I get a job working for some financial institution and I'm making good money. Well, basically that financial institution is just giving a different one money that I owe them, right? So it's like I'm just sort of this vector of money, of interest, So to me, I guess that's the way I think about the kind of feudal aspect of this whole arrangement. Never to say nothing about the kind of cultural, like the idea of like the university as like a guild of where you're sort of marked and you're accepted into this kind of guild that only the sort of privileged are allowed to enter. So yeah, sorry, I was a bit rambly.
Oh, great. Thanks. That's helpful, Adam. So we should start moving towards wrapping up. And I wondered whether our two guests, whether you have any final thoughts you'd like to conclude with. Mitch?
Just thinking on the current state of the university student debt, I would say that probably the arrangement that we're in now is probably one of the worst possible arrangements you could have regarding what it costs to enter a university. So I was thinking of the differences in a mortgage and student debt. You have a loan officer that will tell you no or yes, you qualify for this loan, in the sense that you do not have that for student loans. So I think either a universal approach where college is regarded as a public good, and so long as you show the ability to enter into the halls of academia, your tuition is fully covered, is one way and the ideal way, or accepting that, a sense of where, well, we're going to turn this back into the province of a moneyed elite. And if you if you don't have the financial wherewithal to enter those halls, we're going to deny you. And as draconian as that sounds, I think it would be more honest, and it would undress the university and its claim to a sort of progressive institution. It would dress it down a little bit.
Right. Thanks, Mitch. Adam, any closing thoughts?
I don't know. I think that, maybe I'll close with this. I'll close with what I think to be as a kind of anecdote for what I see to be a kind of one of the kind of core problems with academia. So as I mentioned, I've been adjuncting at this university for a number of years now, and this university, they as a ostensibly as a faculty member, I get all of the kind of university updates, and the president loves to send out emails about how happy the undergraduate students are to be at this university, and that like the undergraduate quality of education is so good, and we're ranked this well in these kinds of institutions. And I've always found that those kinds of emails to be particularly sort of rich, as someone who because I think about my students, and I think about their instructor, who they're paying all this money to go to this university to get an education, and their instructor is teaching he's teaching a 3-3, and he's making so little money that he has to effectively have a full-time job outside of that 3-3. And so the idea that I'm able to give them like a meaningful, or even like an adequate amount of attention that they deserve, is laughable, right? So on the one hand, they're just like, the university loves to congratulate itself about how good it is as a university and what it's doing. It even calls itself a public university for the public good. That's like its slogan. Meanwhile, 20% of its faculty are relegated to, the wages are so bad. I made more working at Lowe's than I do, as an adjunct, right? So it's so laughable on its face, but it's the narrative that it kind of tells itself, right? And to me, I think that is ultimately, I think, obviously it's bad for faculty members who are being exploited to a great degree. But I also think it's deeply sort of unfair and sort of unfortunate to students, many of whom have a great amount of anxiety about their future and about the amount of money they're investing into this thing that like they don't know if it's going to pay off, right? And here they're trying to find their way, and like ostensibly a teacher's job is to steward those students, right? To steward, to give them a path forward and to offer some insight. And I'm not really able to do that as effectively as I would otherwise. And I think that that's a serious indictment of like the current state of affairs. And I think it's very unfortunate. And, to Mitch's point, I think, yeah, path forward. I mean, I think, yeah, eliminating the cost burden, I think is essential to ever kind of beginning to tackle this problem.
Great. Well, at that point, we will draw proceedings to a close. So on behalf of Class Unity, I want to thank our two guests today, Mitch Hernandez and Adam Rensch, for sharing their papers with us and for a really nice discussion. And thanks to everyone who showed up and contributed to the discussion too. And at that point, we will say goodbye. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.